All right, we're good.
All right there. Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Rethinking Faith. I am your host, Mitch Moyer, and I'm joined by the real host. Okay. I'm kind of the another oh, there we go. I'm kind of the I'm kind of the host that introduces the host. Okay. So whether you're looking up or down, either way, how it's oriented on your screen. We are joined again tonight by Mr. James Ballard. These two are two of my favorite people in the world, and the great Ray Luke. Okay, you guys say hi to everybody.
Hey, blessings to everyone. How you guys doing? Glad to be here again with you guys, man. Big Mitch and James.
Yeah, this is good. I'm getting used to this rhythm. I'm glad we're doing this more often.
Yeah, I like that part where you go like Big Mitch and Big James. That's kind of cool, man. I'm certain things are deflating on me now. So, but anyway, we're totally ecstatic to be back again tonight. We have a great episode for you. We're gonna touch a button. That's what we do here at Rethinking Faith, right? We try to bring the truth to the table, and a lot of times when we bring the truth to the table, we tend to touch a button or two. Before we get started, I do want to say again, I can't tell you guys and ladies and whatever, just we're so appreciative of you tuning in. The last couple of episodes have gotten some tremendous feedback that we are totally stoked about. These guys here, man, you can hit them up any time of the night with a question. Okay, they leave their little bells on, so if you send in a question, it's going to wake James or Ray up. Me, once I go to bed, it's over. It's totally over. Okay, so hit them up with questions. Hit us all up. We're just glad you're here. Second thing tonight, I want to hit our resource, one of our resources up front that's going to be utilized in the discussion tonight. And that is a really cool book here. It's called Reading Paul Within Judaism by Mark Nanos.
Great book.
I know Ray and James cannot recommend this enough. It's not that big of a book, but Mark Nanos is becoming one of the leading scholars on the writing or on Paul. And it's cool because he's not a Christian, so he gets an extra point when he goes to heaven. And so, with that said, his work is extremely valuable today as we talk about Paul's letters. We talk about where Paul got his information from, what who he's talking to, the conversation, and so forth like that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to a chapter in Romans that tends to get looked over a lot of times. I know that when I was in the education system and we talked about Romans, it got looked over. Okay. And so with that, we are going to totally look at Romans chapter 11. Now, in the Christian world, sometimes chapter 11 gets pulled out of the Bible and it gets stuck over in the corner somewhere, but we're going to tackle it tonight in a fascinating way. And it's kind of, I titled it the preservation of Israel and the inclusion of the nations. And we're going to, as we unfold this, I think you're going to be really excited and really turned on by some of the information that's being brought here through this chapter. But again, like we always tell you, do your own homework. Go back and pull out some serious resources. Yeah. I know that James has done a lot of preparation for this, looking at some of the Christian commentaries as well, because we always want to try to give a balance. I mean, it's not always, we're just trying to destroy something, but let's try to give it a good balance. So what I'm going to do is, I think tonight we're going to turn this thing down to Mr. James Ballard and let him get this started. And we'll just see where we go with this, Mr. Ballard. All right.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. We're doing it live. Normally we we go through a process of recording it and then uploading it and all that stuff. Now we're just going to do it live. So I see people joining. Shalom, everyone. It's good to see you. So when we did our Q&A, I think last week, we had a question come in about Romans 11, and it really got me thinking that it's a topic in its own. When I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I worked in the Protestant church, a non-denominational church for a couple of years. I don't remember ever seeing this chapter taught. And I think it's not taught because it's a really challenging message to the mainstream doctrine. And we'll look at some of that later. But when you look at what's going on historically, this is a really powerful chapter. And I think I said this last week in the live Q&A. I'm so glad this chapter exists because it's pretty apparent. It's pretty straightforward with what it's saying. And we're going to go back. We're going to go into the words. We're probably just going to read through it and add some content to it. And we have more from last week because we just touched on it briefly last week. So Ray, in your experience, when you first came across this, think back in your Christian days, what did you do with this chapter? How did you read it?
To be honest, James, I would like, I guess, just anyone else within Christendom. I mean, you're not, I mean, a lot of people may think now, looking retrospectively, a lot of Christians are like, the boogeyman or something like that, or their theology is just, they're purposely trying to do this, but it's not so. Yeah. This is the way we've been taught. This is coming down a huge avalanche, a big, huge snowball, and it's getting bigger. 2,000 years, about 2,000 years of theology, and it has strength, And when I studied, as a new believer, I was all in. And what do you have? What kind of sources do you have within traditional Christianity? Everything that they teach you in seminary, which is something that comes through like a lens. This is the way I always explain it. It's a certain type of theological lens, because of the system that it came down through. Gentile Christianity, people who were uneducated and not uneducated, but uneducated in Judaism, uneducated in the faith, practice, culture, tradition, language of Jesus and his apostleship. And we, the Gentiles, are reading this Jewish framework, but without the right tools to understand what's truly going on. Yep. So I too, just like anyone else, had that very much the law was done away with. Everyone now is a Christian. This is the new body, and in the new body, there's no room for Judaism, no room for Jewishness, And so that's kind of where my stance was at.
Yeah.
I would agree too, James. In our experiences, it was that typical, God's done with them. Here comes the new pathway. And a lot of times reading into this or reading into certain sections of this here, it would draw gray areas and questions about this. And just had a most difficult time trying to understand what that really meant. God was done with this, and here comes the new covenant. And for a lot of Christians, that's how it's explained. Here is the new covenant. The old covenant screwed up. Now here comes the new one. And so that was pretty much kind of, without them saying the word screw from the platform, that was pretty much how it was laid out there.
Yeah. So, let's do this. Let's go back and we'll go through the chapter here, but let's set the foundation. And it's probably fair to say that for much of the last, 2,000 years, it probably looked like Israel and the Jewish people were cut off. So in fairness to these older Christian commentaries, they probably looked around them. There was no Israel like we have today. There were no major pockets of thriving Jewish life in any one place for long. They were moved around. They were sent out. So it probably looked like that, right? So Nicholas in the chat said that the Eastern tradition looks at this very different. Yeah, that's right. So we're
Yes.
gonna state right from the outset that we'll be looking mostly at what's relevant in the U.S. and the West, and mainstream Christianity and Catholicism for that matter.
The
But in
church
the
has
time,
the church had to change its theology with time as well, because
Yep.
like you said, the Jewish community for the most part was very weak and always moving, you know. But the least thing that they ever thought was in our times, in this generation, that especially after the Holocaust, that they would get their lands back and that the
Yeah.
Jewish people would return back from such a heinous exile.
yeah,
Right.
And so there's the whole thing of dispensationalism, you know. This is a very, you know, not very ancient, but it's a more of like an early viewpoint from Christianity. And there's various outlooks like that.
Yeah. So I think what I found in the Christian commentaries, so looking at Matthew Henry, he says that the church of God is the olive tree. So the way he reads it is spiritual, right? There's no Jewish people so much anymore as the people of God. It's the church now. And Jews can be a part of that if they convert back into the church, which is Christianity.
Yep.
And of course, that's a problem. That's anachronistic to what Paul's era was. But I will say there's something really interesting. In the 60s, the 1960s, the Catholic Church, Nostra Aetate, it's one of their doctrinal updates, where they basically said the Jews are the people of God. They were chosen by him, and it's by him they were chosen. And they go as far as to say they don't, I mean, I've heard the Pope say this, they don't need Jesus for salvation. God already made a covenant with them. So
Yep.
that's a really big statement to come from the Catholic Church, right? I mean, we have to
True.
admit that that's a really big move. And you can look this up on their website. It's part of the Vatican content
Vatican.
published out there. Vatican II, I believe. But
Yeah.
Nostra Aetate, and I'll put it in the chat, but it's a really fascinating statement because it's coming back to this passage. They get that idea from Paul. They get that doctrine from the writings of Paul. And I think it's because they're seeing what we're seeing in this, that there is a covenant that we are given by God. The Jewish people are given by God, and that's it. So let's do this. Let's just jump in and let's kind of go through this. I'll read the first part and stop me when you want to add something.
Okay.
So Romans 11:1, and he starts off immediately, right? I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, right? God forbid. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people with whom he foreknew. Do you not know what scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? And we should pause here to say, at that time, there were no Christians. Christianity didn't exist yet. There really weren't formalized Messianic Jews, in my opinion. You could say that there were people who were followers of Yeshua, but it was all still within the broader Jewish spectrum. There was no denomination. There was no formal denomination of any other type of Judaism at that time. It just didn't exist.
That's a
talking.
point. Something that we've been trying to combat here lately, with a lot of people talking about Jesus. There's no such thing as Jesus Judaism, or Paul. There's no such thing. There was different segments of first century Judaism for sure, but there was no Jesus, and the apostles were within the traditional Judaism of that time, and they followed according to various scholars, because of the theology is exactly the same, Pharisaic Hasidic Judaism of the first century. We know this. It's crystal clear. Various scholars, Geza Vermes, David Flusser, Shmuel Safrai, all these guys who were first century Judaism scholars, they explained this.
Absolutely. So setting that groundwork, he's talking about Jews today, Orthodox Jews who are not part of this Messianic movement, who aren't Christians, right? So even when Elijah appeals to God against Israel, he says in verse 3, Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left. They seek my life. But what does God reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, they're the remnant chosen by grace. If it's by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. So God has chosen from the broader Jewish community, Israel, those who are obedient, those who are a remnant. They haven't bowed to idolatry. They've stayed faithful to Hashem. So verse 7, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. Right? And it goes into verse 8, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And this is what we said in our Q&A. The blindness is given by God. God chose to conceal, in verse 8, right? God chose to conceal them, as we're going to find, for a purpose. So the reason they don't see, the reason they are in unbelief, as it will say later, is because God put them there. So how are people punished when God put them there, right? Paul's building the case of what it looks like, and then he's about to explain what's going on behind the scenes on another level.
Yeah.
In verse 9, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened, which is the main part of this, so that they cannot see and bend their backs forever. Now, unfortunately, that has been used against the Jewish people in a supersessionistic way, this passage. But what Paul is saying is God is darkening the eyes of people. He's partially blinding people for a purpose. And so people don't get haughty. Paul continues here in verse 11. So I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. So they're not going to fall totally. They're stumbling. They're darkened. Some of them, not all, some of them, right? We're still talking about some of them, but not to the point of falling. Rather, through their trespass, their blindness, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them want to get back into the game, so to speak. So he says it right there. It's very plain. What do you see, Ray?
There's an amazing comment by the scholar Mark Nanos. Most of his work is on Paul the Apostle and Paul the Apostle within Judaism. And in a work that he has, Romans within Judaism, it's volume 2 of the book that Mitch showed there in the beginning of our show. He says, he has this to say about Romans 11. He says, in the balance of Romans 10 and in the beginning of chapter 11, Paul continues to explain that although not all Israelites are presently undertaking to herald the good news to the nations, which is a prophetic call of Israel to be a light unto the nations, he says that there are some Israelites who are, such as Paul, and thus that Israel as a whole is fulfilling whole role. Remember, they're one entity, right? So it says, albeit in an unexpected, divided, and divisive way. His readiness to do so is not because he has done better deeds or that others worse ones. This reflects God's inscrutable design for how to achieve God's objective to show mercy to the nations, and thereafter to show mercy to the rest of the Israelites on the same terms as has been shown to the nations. That is an amazing quote by Dr. Mark Nanos.
That's amazing. And that touches on the point that it doesn't take 100% of people believing or doing mitzvot or whatever, right? We see this with Abraham. An entire city is spared if a certain number of people are righteous. It only has to be a small number of people for the job to be sufficiently done. Not until the redemption do we start to see 100% buy-in. It's only a small number of people.
There's something that should be mentioned to our listeners too. That, I mean, it's touched on in these chapters. A lot of times there's this whole Christianity versus Judaism type of it's like a battle, a consistent battle where it says, we're saved by Jesus, by grace, right? And Jews they try to have their salvation through works. This is not true at all, not even in the least. The Jews too understand that they have been saved by God's grace, right? And they're choosing, God's choosing of them has been by God's grace. Their every breath that they take is by God's grace. They understand this. But here's the big but. Like Yeshua, like the apostles, they're under an eternal covenant with God. Within this covenant, God has told them that if they keep the regulations and the stipulations of the covenant, the Torah, right? If you keep it, you'll be blessed. And if you were to fail, God will deal with you as a father deals with his children, and he would punish you. This is the curses of the Torah, etc. Right? Jews, if you go speak to a Jew today in an Orthodox community, he'll tell you that we hang on the merits of our forefathers because God chose their descendants because of them through Abraham, Jacob. So it's very similar to how many say, oh, we have merit in Yeshua. It's very similar to what's going there with the Israelites.
Yeah.
Okay. The nations didn't have anything like this, but the Jewish people do. Hence why the Catholic Church was able to make such a statement. They understand that. And the Jews hang on the merit of the patriarchs, of the avos. And this is very, very important to understand, or you will not understand what's going on with Paul. A Jew, I mean, it's in Pirkei Avos. It says in the very beginning, all Israel has a share in the world to come. If you hear that and you have no context, you'd be like, what? Even sinners have a share in the world to come, right? Doesn't make any sense. But you have to understand the whole context of what's going on. Yeah. A Jew being in the covenant has a share in the world to come. He's part of the whole, especially if he's living according to the stipulations. And he can X himself out. He can excommunicate himself or excise himself by being a wicked person, right? Sure. And as Paul says here, you can lose your share, right? So it is important to keep to the stipulations. Very much similar to how Christians say, oh, all our sins are forgiven in Jesus. It's not so either, because Jesus says elsewhere in plenty of places that at that day, I will tell you, I never knew you. What's all this about? He's forgiven us for our sins, past, future. Nope, doesn't work like that.
Yeah, so beautiful. So I don't know if I've read this to you before. The Catholic doctrine says exactly what you said. It says, as scripture testifies, Jerusalem did not recognize the time of her visitation, quoting a verse, nor did the Jews in large numbers accept the gospel. Indeed, a lot opposed its spreading. Nevertheless, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers.
Wow.
So they get it, right? And it, the way I think it works in their minds early on was like the land. Israel, so as a descendant, I have a connection to the land. And through the law of return through Israel, there is stipend and Hebrew training and all of these things available to me and my family if we choose to take it. Now, we're not in a place to do that, but it's kind of the same way because of Abraham walking the land and the land being given to him in Genesis. I think it's Genesis 21. It's a deed. It's a deed of ownership. So all the descendants, the way the Eastern cultures work, all those descendants own part of that land. That's why a lot of Muslim countries are constantly at battle with each other because of the way the boundaries were drawn up by Britain. But that land is owned by one particular group and not this group. So you have this idea of this cascading ownership from the fathers, the patriarchs. We don't have that in our country today. So it's very hard to grasp this concept. Really good stuff. So verse 12, and this is where we're getting into the good stuff now. This is where people tend to kind of trip up. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Saying, when they are brought back, when Israel is saved, how much more rich will the world be blessed by it? Keep that in mind, because there's a midrash I want to talk about in a second. Verse 13, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them, redeem some of them, bring them out of this stupor, right? For if their rejection means reconciliation, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead?
This is I think about this, man. I think about the segment we made, Mitch, James, the segment we made on divine providence, the situation, how it transpired, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about this, all of our viewers and listeners, think about these things. The New Testament, as we have it, right, begins with the Gospels, which is like a biography on Jesus's life, his teachings, his deeds, etc. You know that Jesus never, it's nowhere in the Gospels seen preaching to Gentiles or having any idea to bring this message to the non-Jews. And it was not so much to him. This was something that was, I mean, there were some people that were trying to make converts out of the non-Jews, but it wasn't a very popular thing, right? And even to this day, Judaism is not very out, trying to proselytize as much. There had been their time, but because Abraham did it, etc. But think about this: Paul's never mentioned in the Gospels. He's nowhere to be found. We don't run into him until after Jesus' death. Okay, and then he was what? He was a persecutor of this way, of these people. So what am I trying to say? That it was not in the mind of Jesus. I mean, maybe he understood the prophecies as all Jews understand, that in the end, all the nations will come to believe in God. But what are the details to that? How is that supposed to happen? Look at how God works. He got somebody who's persecuting the believers in Yeshua to be the person to reach back out to the non-Jews. And it wasn't all of them. And this is what Paul's talking about. I mean, and his whole message here in Romans 11 is about, don't make yourself haughty against the natural, the root, which is Israel, the Jewish people. I mean, fear God. In any way, are they being rejected? In no way, God forbid. This is all in God's inscrutable divine providence that he has worked this out. And this is one of the greatest merits, in my opinion, as to why Yeshua is one of the greatest candidates for the Messiah. Because he didn't have a plan that they were going to go to the nations to bring that was never in the books. This didn't happen until after his.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's usually attributed with that. The way some will pose it, sometimes Jews, because they've heard it taught this way, that he created a new religion. But it's obviously not in the text, right? It's very far from it. And Paul didn't intentionally do that as well. Here he's taking this group of people, they're divergent in the community. They're not staying in their spot. They're kind of combative with the Jews in the synagogue community. Paul's writing to them to kind of tone them down a little bit and teach them that this is the root. You are grafted in. You can be removed very easily. And he says that. In verse 16 and 17, he's leveraging two different midrash. And I'm going to put the reference in the chat and in the source notes. We won't go through those again since we did it in our Q&A. But the dough offered as first fruits is holy. So is the whole lump. That's a midrash, and it's a very technical midrash on a particular mitzvah of breaking off a corner of the dough. And then he goes, if the root is holy, so are the branches. Again, it's another midrash. In the Talmud, the rabbis talk about the nations being grafted in, and they use the word grafted because the word for blessing and the word for grafting are has a very similar sound. It's from the same, phonetically, it's very similar. So in the Talmud, Yevamot 63, the rabbis are talking about people like Ruth and Naamah, the Ammonite, who married Solomon. They were grafted in. So the rabbis have this metaphor in the back of their minds. Paul's not making it up. He's just quoting what he was trained to quote in reference to the nations being brought in. So it's a one-to-one comparison. And here's where it gets good. Verse 17, if some of the branches were broken off And you, although a wild shoot, were grafted in among others and now share in the root of the olive tree. Don't be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. So we get this idea that the root is ever present. The root supports you, not you support the root. So the root, that essence of Israel, is always ever present. And
Yep.
the wild branches can be taken out pretty quickly. This is where we said Mark Nanos does an amazing job. That word eklao, for broken off, usually in English,
Yeah.
can also be cracked or bent.
Yes.
Not
Yeah.
broken off, cut off entirely. not the word that we see it rendered as in English. In English, you get this idea, it's broken off. And then if you add to that Yeshua's words, a totally different context, any branch that doesn't produce fruit gets thrown into the fire. If you combine those, and I'm sure people have done it because I just did it, you get the idea that Israel gone, new branches are stuck in. But what are they? Even if it is that, let's just take it at its face value. They're still the root. They're still the essence of Israel.
Yes.
But Nanos makes a really good point, and I put a link in there. He breaks it down if you're really into the technicality, and he makes a really strong point that the word here is it's bent, or
Yes.
when you're going to
Yes.
graft a branch. A friend of mine and I,
Yes.
he was explaining to me the process. You bend it and you jam another shoot in. All of that is so that the tree remains productive. You don't hack off the branches producing fruit and then put wild ones in, which may not take. All of it is about producing fruit. So you do it in the most efficient way possible. You bend a branch, you know, in this sense, you crack it, you bend it down, you don't hack it off. God's doing this because he wants the tree to produce the fruit it's supposed to produce.
Yes.
Right? It would be just bizarre if somebody had an olive tree and they just cut off all the branches and then just started grafting in. It would just be, it wouldn't make any sense.
It would. And James, if you don't mind, I was going to share just a small piece on that. This is out of Romans 11. This comes again from the Jewish annotated New Testament, and this is a portion that Jill Levine threw in there. It says the olive tree allegory is designed not to describe Israel per se, but to present the precarious place of the wild shoot among Israelites, since it suggests that some Israelites have been cut off in order to make the fortiori case that the wild shoot is all the more vulnerable to being cut off. The comparison conflicts with that of some heralds stumbling through, though they have not fallen, and the overall message that all Israel will be preserved, kept safe during the threatening process. Paul uses the ekleo to refer to the broken branches. However, unless specifically referred to as a broken off, ekleo can refer to something broken or dislocated or bent, as you put it, but not severed. And see, when Paul warns that the wild branch, which has been indeed suffered being cut off and grafted in, that it could be severed if it looks arrogantly upon the broken branches. Paul switches to ekopto, or cut off, and he again uses the ekopto in verse 24 here. That leads to the impression that Paul regards some natural branches as broken off, although that is an inference that does not seem to be intended when he begins the allegory. It is rather an inference developed from the effort to rebuke the wild shoot, which has been cut off from its tree to be grafted in, and thus is in a precarious place compared to the natural branches. The tree is not described as Israel, and Paul does not suggest that non-Israelites become members of Israel. The tree represents all of who are in the family of God, Israelite branches as well as ones from the other nations.
Yep. That's excellent.
It's very interesting, guys, that in the Zohar, in a few other commentaries, it is said that Israel was exiled among the nations in order to sift sparks. Okay, these sparks have different connotations. They can mean a lot of things, but one of the meanings is souls, sifting souls for God.
Yeah.
Whether that means they convert, become Jewish, or they get brought under the wings of the Shekhinah as righteous non-Jew. And there's ways for that. We've talked about it in other segments. Now, that's very interesting, fast forwarding through time since the days of the apostles and Yeshua. Because, for example, for myself now that I've come to the understanding of the historical and the religious background of Yeshua and the apostles, if the Jews were no longer to be found, how would I ever truly be able to understand Jesus or the apostles? I would not be able to. I would continue on in error throughout time. We would have just overlaid Jesus and the apostles with a new religion, with a new background, with a new tradition, with a new everything. But the real person, we wouldn't understand. So it is largely due to the Jewish people preserving themselves throughout this harsh exile, preserving the traditions, preserving the teachings that Yeshua himself kept.
Yeah.
And that is amazing without really being outwardly in their proselytization of the nations. They are still doing work. They have still been doing work and sifting a lot of sparks that has helped us, right? And when you look at the Jewish people, what are they doing? They're doing everything that God has commanded them to do. And the remnant of Israel, keeping the covenant, staying holy. Holy is separate. Keeping the will of God, keeping the commandments, keeping the holy days. And this is like a signpost to the nations that has helped for us to understand them in its correct context.
And good. A friend of mine reminded me too, we were talking about this topic throughout history. And this is a quote from Rabbi Mark Kinzer. He's a Messianic Jewish rabbi, but he's a pretty solid scholar. He said, historically, a no to Jesus has been a yes to God for Orthodox Jews. A no to the presentation of Jesus is a yes to Hashem.
Yes.
So, right, what do you do with that? They're obeying God. Brilliant points, though. And Mitch, I really like what you read, because the next few passages, it does seem Paul is setting up this hyperbolic statement as a way of kind of scaring these defectors, if you will. I don't know if they're defectors really, but these people who are kind of going astray. He's kind of trying to scare them straight a little bit. He says, then you will say branches were broken, bent, whatever, grafted in, so that I may be grafted in. That's true. They were broken because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And then he says, note then the kindness and severity of God towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. So he's saying, you're only here because of your faith, and that's the bottom line. Then he continues, otherwise you indeed will be cut off. And that's where he uses the word cut off. That's where he starts to use the language of actually cut off. And he said, even, and this is really fascinating, in verse 23, and even then, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. Now, what's really interesting, that idea of unbelief, Paul uses that same word in Romans 3. And I'm just going to jump to that real quick, because this, I think you have to have that in mind when you're reading this. He says in Romans 3, verses 1, then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Is there any value in the ceremony of circumcision? Yes, there are great benefits. First of all, the Jews were entrusted with the whole revelation of God. True, some of them were unfaithful, and unbelief is the word. But just because they were, does that mean that God will be unfaithful, right? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true, as the scriptures say about him. So Paul is referencing this idea even as early as the first and second and third chapter of Romans. He's kind of laying the groundwork that even though it appears this way, this covenant with the people is from God, and even if everyone goes astray, God will maintain it.
Yep.
And he says, this is the last part. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature, right? Consider pagans, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? So that tree is ever present. We're talking about a few people somewhere that have been bent, removed, blinded, darkened, but the tree is ever present because that's the covenant God has with the people of Israel to the world.
That's big, and I can't help but look at, for example, the story of Joseph and his brothers. Right, the brothers, except for maybe two of them, confined Joseph to death. Basically, they didn't literally kill him. Judah and they stopped short of that, but selling him off to the nations was, he could have been killed.
Yeah.
And it's looked upon this way. This sin was pretty bad, but in God's will that we cannot, it's too high for us to understand. It's too great. What happened to Joseph where he was at? I mean, he rose up through the ranks to become viceroy to Pharaoh. And it was God's grace, even though they had committed such a horrible sin to their own father, one of the patriarchs, to their brother, right?
Yeah.
God still used this situation that, he could have cut them off. These are the tribesmen, but he did not. Did they suffer? Indeed, they suffered. Not knowing, Joseph never revealed himself in the beginning, not knowing all the details. They suffered horribly. And at the end, what happened? Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, and there was a lot of pain there. But I can't help but notice this, that how Paul's talking about this, like, their unbelief, not believing at a certain moment, but they still have a covenant. God has a covenant with them. He's not wiping this covenant off. He's not gonna stop his covenant, as you said, James. If others are unfaithful, he will always be faithful, and that's what we see over and over in the scriptures.
And Ray, that's exactly what's said in certain environments. Is he is deleting that covenant. He is shutting it down and saying that we now have this new covenant, which is creating this new religion, which is Jesus was sent to create this new religion, and now it's being pushed out through Paul. And that, like you said, it's just.
But I would ask the question, Mitch, if God can break his covenant, a covenant that he says that he will uphold, and break away, because this is what is said, then how can we trust him to keep the covenant with Jesus, or whatever, the new covenant made? Exactly. How can we trust him?
Well, to add to that, we had a person comment in the chat. It's interesting. It was Family Apologetics. She goes, it's interesting how even Yeshua says, keep the commandments when asked how to inherit the eternal life. You don't ever hear that. If you say that, if you say that, that's what Jesus says. If you say that, there's got to be a context by which you're saying it in. It's not a gray area. It's not a gray misunderstanding. It's black and white. And Jesus did a lot of that, within the Sermon on the Mount and within his discussions, straight up. But it gets it gets pushed to the side, because how is that going to then establish the new? How is that going to support the establishment of the new covenant
But
and do away with the old?
I would ask you another question. How are we to know that we're upholding the covenant? Explain to me, how do we know that we're upholding the new covenant? What is the evidence that we're holding on to this covenant? Because Christians love to say that the new covenant is made with Jesus. That's not true. That's not true. The new covenant, the only new covenant that we hear, which is a renewal of the covenant, is in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 on. And you know who that renewal of this covenant is made with? With the Jewish people, with all the 12 tribes of Israel.
But that ain't going to fly in the church, son, because that does not support the idea that simple faith outweighs that of Torah, period.
Well, what did Jesus say in John 4 to the woman at the well? Salvation comes through the
Jews.
And that is, I never hear that. Never do I have ever heard that. You know,
what would it mean to a non-Jew, to a Christian? What would that mean? The words of Jesus.
It doesn't mean what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It doesn't mean what it means as Jesus did what he did. Okay, salvation to the Jew. You're almost rewriting that as as a definition that's completely out of context and different than what was, than what's portrayed within the church or within a tent during an evangelistic gathering, when you need to come up with some good numbers by Monday morning. So
there's a system. There's a system at play that is in total, man. I love my Christian brothers.
Yes.
They're amazing people. But the system that they follow, it is a system that is totally contrary to the practice, faith, and teaching of Yeshua and his apostles.
Yes, but Ray, why can they not read what we read? Even a lot of times, if we read a English version of an interpretation, okay, which a lot of times does not line up with what the Hebrew is and how that's brought along as the undercurrent for what we read within what they call the New Testament.
Because God has put a partial hardening.
Definitely. No, if there's a partial hardening on the Jewish people, there seems to be a complete hardening and blindness on the non-Jewish world.
For a time, right? Mm-hmm. But Ray, what you said about Israel and Joseph, I believe that is what Paul is closing out this chapter with. The deliverer will come from Zion and will banish ungodliness from Jacob, right? He says that in 26. And in verse 25, he says, don't be wise in your own sight. I don't want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come, a partial blindness upon Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel is saved. So it's like the background Paul has in mind, I'm sure, is the Joseph story, because that's the model. That's the pervasive model of one person carrying and saving the whole nation, bringing them along in obedience to the Creator, so the benefit of the world and the benefit of Israel can be brought in eventually.
The midrashim explained that what was Joseph doing in Egypt while he was there? It says that he was circumcising Egyptians, meaning he was bringing them under the wings of the Shekinah. He was bringing many of these non-Jews to the belief in the one true God.
Yep.
It taught that, according to the verses in Genesis, that it says it twice that Jacob had Joseph, whatever. And so the commentaries explain that what this means is that Joseph was identical to his father Jacob.
Yep.
And what do you mean identical? Do you look exactly the same? Or they say, yeah, but what it mostly means is that spiritually, he was like his father Jacob. Very high quality of spirituality. And this is the reason why Jacob was almost handing everything to his younger son. And he had a type of, like, I wouldn't say favoritism, but there was a connection, a real connection there. And so it is explained that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they learned in the tents of Shem and Aber, which is the first yeshiva, the first biblical school in the world. But so did Joseph. Joseph did too. He went to the same schools and learned. And he was one that was ripe, like Paul, to be able to reach out. Rav Ginsburg, there was something cosmopolitan about Joseph, that this is something that kind of like maybe unconsciously brought some type of friction between the brothers and Joseph. They couldn't get down to it. But this is the main reason why Joseph was chosen, because he embodied all the great spirituality, Torah, the belief in the one true God, the creator. He embodied all this in one person. The whole nation has this identity. The whole nation is supposed to have this identity, carry the covenant, spread monotheism, spread the will of God. But Joseph carried it in himself. And this is the reason why he was able to send, in God's inscrutable plan, sent to the non-Jewish world. And he brought much light there. He did.
Amazing. And so Yuji reminded me of this. What were the brothers doing in the Midrash when they got to Egypt? They were looking for him and they couldn't find him. He's concealed. Right? It's like, who today in the Jewish world isn't looking for Mashiach? Who isn't waiting concealed? Right? Like, we're in a phase when it's not time yet for people to see the revelation of Mashiach.
The Kabbalists, I don't know if you've heard this, James, Mitch. The Kabbalists explain Mashiach can be revealed, and you ask yourself, what is going on? The Mashiach can be revealed from Israel, which, according to the prophecies, I thought that's where he's supposed to be revealed from, or from exile. What? How? How can he be revealed from the exile if he's supposed to come from the Jewish nation within the land of Israel? But they say that he can be revealed from the exile without a lot of background information that we spoke about in our last segment about there's these teachings of the sages. Mashiach can be revealed, concealed, and revealed again. If Joseph was with his brothers in the land, right? This is where he was found. But this is one was in a concealed fashion, right? But he was there. But then after being revealed in the land, he was concealed. And where did he find himself in? In exile. And then he's revealed again. And maybe it could be, according to the sages, they say that if Israel is not meritorious, if they do not merit the redemption the way they're supposed to be, it could be that the identity of the Messiah could be questioned. And he cannot be, they can't see him. Where is he? We don't know where he's at. And he could be right there. But if this happens to the Jewish people, right? And Paul alludes to this various times. He says the same thing. To them, the Jews, was given all these magnificent, beautiful gifts, which is the eternal covenant, the will of God. When I say the will of God, I mean the commandments. That's the will of God. Okay. The covenants, the promises, all these things are given to the Jewish people. And they can miss such an important thing that has to do with the redemption. They can miss the identity of God's agent of redemption, who will guide us there, right? But this is in order because God has had grace on, he's having grace upon the non-Jewish world. How? How is the non-Jewish world able to take part in this situation? How would God ever do that? If not through what has transpired? I always ask myself, the Jewish people believe that the Messiah will come. But I always say, if the Messiah were to start from ground zero, man, he has his work cut out for him. There's a lot of work to do, because if it's not Jesus, how would he get all these non-Jews to believe in the Torah and believe in God's will and believe in one God? How would he be able to do that if you don't have a whole time? You would need a lot of the ground set up, which actually the Rambam Maimonides says that Christianity has played this role. So has Islam. To make the nations ripe for the redemption.
Yes. Good point, Ray. Good point.
And this is why we mentioned this last time, but there's this idea, the Vilna Gaon teaches it, or it's at least in the school of the Vilna Gaon. Revelation of light from Hashem comes, it's revealed from above. But if Israel is not meritorious enough to grasp it, the light falls to the secular world. And that
Wow.
revelation comes out. It's distorted, but it comes out. Because God continues to push people towards where they need to go. And if you look at the way science, big science, industrial revolution, big milestones in science, they always correspond to the same time as some Torah
Spiritual.
giant. Some like
right.
the Arizal or the Ramchal, as someone mentioned down here, Nicholas mentioned, or the Baal Shem Tov, or Rashi or Maimonides. Look at what happened in the world, in the secular world, and you'll see that he was receiving the light, but Israel wasn't able to receive the light. So the revelation went to the nations in some form or another. And sometimes it comes back imperfect, but the revelation came and humanity steps up a level. And this has been going on since well, Adam and Eve, since the sin, since Genesis 3, since the garden, right? But this is how Hashem has been moving it. And no doubt Yeshua has been a part of that. And there's no other person who brought Torah to the world. And here we are tonight. And now we're leveraging technology. We can communicate. We can share Torah online. So God is moving these things forward. And it looks like it's not happening, but it's happening all around us. But it's this idea that if we're not ready for it, if we're not a vessel, if Israel doesn't merit receiving it in full, then it gets fragmented. And that's what we've seen over time, largely.
Yeah. I mean, I can't help but see like, that this partial hardening to Israel, in the sense of, especially if Jesus is the Messiah, not being able to see him, he's so concealed. But this is worked in God's plan in order to reach out to the nations and slowly bring them. And as I see it today, you and I, Mitch, we're individuals. We're definitely not as big as the whole community of Christianity, right? So I say to myself, Christianity, the Messianics, they still so much so need the Jewish people. It's not even funny, because they're so ripe to being cashered. Cashered means to have the right understanding of what's going on in God's plan. So close. But yeah. I believe with all of my heart that without the Jewish people, without the understanding that they have as not believers in Jesus, if they don't have this understanding, there will be no redemption, or the redemption will come in a very, very harsh manner that we don't want. We don't want it that way. We should merit, God willing. Paul says, continuing in verse 28, he says, as regards to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, for the Gentiles' sake, meaning that they don't see it yet. They don't see this man. This is not the man. But as regards of election, listen carefully, guys. They are beloved for the sake of the forefathers. We just talked about that.
Yep.
For the gifts, listen, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. What is it about that Christianity doesn't understand?
Irrevocable.
You can't break that. The covenant is unbreakable, because God is unbreakable. He's eternal. He's the one holding on to that.
Yeah.
For just as you were at one time disobedient, very much so, to God, but now have received mercy because of disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Amazing. I mean, that's amazing.
And it's so
ahead.
straightforward.
Yep.
It's when you are inside of a system that seems coherent, these inconsistencies, these logical breakdowns, or the gaps that are there, you don't see them from the inside. When you get out and you look back from a different perspective, you see that it's said it all the time. It's been there in every translation. Even if you bend it, what you just read, Ray, is pretty much the end of the discussion. Yet, that's not how it's been read. But people are waking up to it. This is becoming a common read. This question is being asked. Someone asked us this question, right? It wasn't something we were talking about.
Right.
Go ahead. I just wanted to say, because when you see it, it's like.
And then ultimately, at the end of our discussion, Christians love saying this, and a lot of people love saying this. What does it mean to be grafted in? Grafted into what? The tree is Israel. And if we're grafted into Israel, we're being nourished by that root. We're being nourished by that root. That root is, as we understand it, the Torah, Judaism, the will of God. This is the way to understand things. Judaism is a universal religion. It is the one who has taught the nations about the one true God, even if later on things have been distorted. But that's what it means to be grafted in to something that was already there. And we are to partake, be co-workers, and help the Jewish people to merit redemption.
Very well put.
Amazing.
Good job, guys. Good job. Well, as we kind of wrap this up here tonight, there is a lot in chapter 11. There's a lot that gets kind of shoved under the rug a lot of times when it's discussed and brought out. But I think that we've put some points out there that hopefully will allow people to further investigate, further study, but further question and try to get a better grasp on just, what it is that's going on here. Because for so long, as you know, Ray, and James, for so long, this just gets twisted and more twisted. But then what happens is it becomes very watered down. And then as it becomes watered down, it's easy to just go over and, becomes a mess. So, but you guys have anything you want to say before we close down chapter 11 of Romans?
Go ahead, Ray.
Oh no, I mean, we covered a lot, man. That was a lot. This was a tough chapter and something that we had to review. So I'm glad you brought that up, James, to do this show today.
Yes.
No, one of the listeners did, just really good questions. So I would just say thank you for everyone tuning in. Thank you for everyone's going to watch it after asynchronously. Keep throwing your questions at us. These are great. Sometimes, we are into different spaces or we're reading different things, and there might be something great that we're just not thinking about. So keep communicating. Let us know what you think of the show. As always, thank you for sharing and liking. It's good. It feels good to have people tuning in and giving us input and feedback so we can become better too. So very thankful for that.
Well said, James. And on that note, we thank you guys again for joining us. Blessings to you, your family, and especially to those that you share this with out there. Keep sharing, keep questioning, and keep coming back. Most of all, you guys take care and have a good night.